still see the impact. But of course, the counter to this is that when we were talking about the desire for commodities earlier and how that creates happiness, Ibn Khaldun wouldn't, I believe, say that. He would say it creates happiness, but he wouldn't expect that to lead to good things. He would expect that this happiness would eventually cause the degradation of society. I hope I pronounced that right. But instead, it actually, the pursuit of happiness creates golden ages, which are distinctly good. So it works. The happiness system works for Khaldun in some areas, but doesn't for all of them. But another thing that I think Khaldun would agree with is that you also can see in the happiness formula, which I've got up again, you get some from social policies, but we're not going to worry about that right now. But underneath that, you get some from buildings. Now, that's when I go to purchase, I can create buildings here. It takes a certain amount of production to build them over time. You can only look at one building at a time, which isn't entirely realistic, but let's ignore that for now. We can create buildings. So, for example, a Colosseum will cost me 1 gold every turn and give me 2 happiness. What this means for Khaldun is that people are getting happy when they're making buildings in a city, which would encourage people to make buildings. So if you were a nomadic group and you were just starting off, you haven't made Paris yet, it's a good idea for you to settle down and make some buildings. It encourages you to do that. He would say this ultimately leads to the downfall of society, but what this is good for is providing an incentive that he needs for his argument, for people to actually go and make cities. So the next thing, the next impact of happiness is what happens when happiness gets too low. Now you can't see it in this chart, so I'm just going to have to tell you. When your happiness gets too low, that is -10 or below. See, but between 0 and -10, you just get slowed population growth, which I didn't really see an impact. But between -10 and -20, and below that, it just increases the rate, you'll start to get uprisings, where there will be enemy units that will appear near your cities and start attacking things. Now, this is actually where Khaldun gets his greatest benefit, because I think he would see this as the system starting to fall apart. You built too many cities, you got too big of a population, and you were not able to keep citizens happy, and ultimately what happened is it started to crumble. Also, when you have low happiness, even if it's not caused by the rebels coming and attacking things, you'll have other countries notice that your population's growing slower and see it as an opportunity to attack you. So I think Khaldun would see that as the degradation of society and it ultimately becoming weaker and not being able to defend itself. Because also lower happiness does reduce the ability of your offensive troops to fight as well. Which, if that is directly caused by having more cities and more population, Khaldun may also argue that that's actually people becoming weaker because they're not accustomed to doing the battle like the barbarians in this game, or Bedouins. I just mentioned barbarians. We're gonna get into that in a minute. But before I do, the other thing I want to talk about is just that when the uprisings. Hobbes, I think, would also have something to say about this, because I like Hobbes and I want to talk about Hobbes. He talks about how there is a point when the state of war is better than an oppressive government, and I think he would say that when you get that low into unhappiness, that is where it is better. Usually, what causes that low of unhappiness is not just having population, not just having too many cities, but also if you decide, or rather, if I decide to attack. Let's not pick that city because I can't pronounce its name. York, and I take it over. The citizens in that city will not only be adding unhappiness due to population, not only be adding unhappiness due to the number of cities, but also simply because it is an occupied city, it will be adding more unhappiness. I can also decide to set the city on fire, which would create even more unhappiness than that. And so until I build a courthouse and in that city, it's creating a lot of unhappiness, and you may argue that some people in that city would find the risk of death through going into the state of war preferable to remaining in that conquering city. This is the closest thing to consent we have in this game, but Hobbes would see that as the point where war is greater than the tyranny of my conquering nation. And the last person that I think would have an important impact here is actually Rousseau, where when people decide to rebel against me, I naturally kill them because I need to keep my empire as strong as possible. And you could argue that that's sort of forcing them to be free, or at least forcing the people who didn't rebel to be free, because I'm killing the people that decide to rebel. So through the fear of punishment, people will be forced not to rebel. So the next thing I want to talk about is barbarians. Now, unfortunately, I was an idiot and went a little bit too far into the game, and you can't actually see any barbarians. So you're going to have to just take my word that they exist. They are listed as a different than any other city. You can see I've got the borders of all of my territories here. And this is the border of England, this is the border of, I think this is India, and this, the dotted border, or the dashed borders, are of different city-states that are not in competition to win the game. They don't have borders, so they are a lot like the Bedouins, because they have areas where they quote-unquote settle, but they often roam from those areas, and they'll have one person who maybe stays there, but they'll have another militant group roaming around doing other things. But this is where a game actually, I think, disagrees with Khaldun, because these groups, rather than being stronger and like fearsome, are actually at the very beginning of the game just about as strong as you are, and they only get weaker from there. Even if you have a nation that is incredibly unhappy, crumbling, falling apart, you will not be overtaken by barbarians. It's a statistical impossibility. This is also anti-Rousseau, because we see that there's no real penalty for entering into a society. Now, granted, they do have some society because they're traveling in groups, they have a base area, but they're the closest things to not having a society that we have, because there's no way to communicate with them through any like leader. Because, like, for example, even if I'm talking to a city-state, I'm talking to a leader of Dublin or Genoa or whatever. But they have no leaders, so it's the closest thing we've got to not having a society. And there's no real penalty for having a society. They are at a distinct disadvantage from everyone else. The barbarians will never win the game, even if they were able to. So moving on, the other application for the barbarians is that they're also the closest thing that the game has to the state of nature. Because they don't actively research things, they don't actively cooperate with other barbarians, they only have their small group, and I don't know if you can even call it a group, just because I think one of the limitations of the game is that when they have a unit, they can't have only one person. So it may be that these are meant to be just random people walking around on their own that just happen to be in a group, because there's nothing else, there's no other way the game can represent them. So this obviously applies very distinctly to Hobbes, because these groups that are the closest thing we've got to the state of nature are always at war with everyone. So the state of nature in that case is a state of war. It flies directly in the face of Locke and Rousseau. Because if I have, like, I knew there's a barbarian encampment somewhere up here that I have not actually discovered. The gray area where you can see the land is the fog of war, where I've been there before, but I'm not looking there right now, so I can't see it. And the clouds are undiscovered areas. So you can see I haven't actually been up here. I know there's a barbarian encampment up there somewhere, but I don't know where. If I were to send someone up there, even if it was just a random scout, no threat, they will attack the scout. They don't need to declare war on me, they are always at war with me. It would be the same for any other person on this map. So because barbarians are always at war with everyone, they're in a state of war naturally. Since it's the closest thing to the state of nature, that very much supports Hobbes. And this actually leads to a sort of persecution of them almost, because for example, if a barbarian encampment pops up near, we'll say, Dublin, like right here, they will offer me gold and reward for killing that barbarian encampment. So that's just another way that this actually goes against, not against Hobbes, but against Khaldun, because they are actively fought against and they are wiped out off of the map as quickly as possible. And it supports Hobbes because there's a reason to try and get out of that barbarian state, because you don't want everyone to be fighting you. You don't want people to be paying other powerful nations to kill you. So that really also supports Hobbes. But the barbarians are always acting in self-interest as well. That's why they always have one person defending their camp as another person goes around, and they'll abduct citizens. So if I brought a worker, one of these units, no offensive capabilities, I brought him over to the barbarian encampment, they can actually steal the worker from me. I lose control, it becomes their worker. They don't actually do anything with the worker, but it prevents me from advancing closer to their territory for a while. And this is naturally good for them, because I was going to wipe them out anyway, it just slows it down. So because they're acting in self-interest, that basically supports anyone who argues that naturally people will act in self-interest, but I'm applying it specifically to Hobbes because of the other things I've mentioned, because they're acting specifically in self-interest. They're trying to do whatever they can in the state of war to succeed. That's a very Hobbesian idea. And they also don't leave the base very long, which prevents them from being vulnerable, because the base is usually in a fortified location. But the other thing that we can look at with specifically the self-interest is not just for barbarians, it's also for nations as a whole. If I were to declare war on England, because I'm trying to avoid pronouncing any of these names that I'm going to butcher, I could abduct their citizens and take control over them. Because we're at war, there's no penalty from other nations I need to worry about. They're not going to say, whoa, what are you doing? And it's a distinct benefit for me. So everyone's doing that, acting in self-interest, which, again, is very Hobbesian, because there is no sovereign between all of our sovereign nations. We all didn't decide to give up our power to God or something. And so naturally what that means is that we're going to do whatever we can to beat each other. That's the entire point of the game, which is very Hobbesian. The other thing, specifically with conversion, is that there's no like pop-up that asks, like, would you like to ask if these workers would like to consent to being abducted into your nation? Which is also, it fits very well into Hume's ideology, and sort of what my paper said about Hobbes as well, in that they don't ever get a chance to consent or not consent. There's no consent question. If you take over those citizens, if they were not to consent, I would just kill them, and even if that were in the game. And so obviously they just consent, no question. Fits very well into Hume. Yeah, there's no consent for that. But to move back to barbarians, the last thing I wanted to talk about with regard to them is Malinowski's beliefs. Civ, I think, would disagree with Malinowski, so it does not support Malinowski's ideas, because there are distinctly better societies. There are cultures that are simply better. The barbarians never actually get any social policies that would benefit them. They are seen as barbaric. I mean, that's the simplest word for it. They do not have the ability to even compete on a cultural level. So when we think of how he thinks of more primitive economic man and needing to debunk that as a theory, Civ completely supports it. And actually, this goes far enough to go to the civilized civilizations, if you will, where all of these settled nations with great powers and expansions and everything like that would not fit with the Trobriand Islanders. We even have better civilizations, more cultured civilizations among there. You actually get a culture rating every turn